Hello, everybody. Welcome to New and Dangerous Opinions, brought to you by the Providence Post, providencepost.com. I'm your host, Derek Peterson. Today is February 22nd, year of our Lord 2026. Okay, so today we're going to talk about a subject that I think is pretty important because if you don't know where you came from, it's kind of hard to know where you're going, and it's impossible to ever get back there again. And today we don't seem to be going in a very good direction. So I thought we'd go back and look. I mean, everyone agrees that we're a Christian nation, but what kind of Christians were we? Were we Protestant? Were we Catholic? Were we Baptist? What exactly kind of Christian were we? We're going to take a look at some of the doctrines associated with those various belief systems and see exactly what we were and where we came from. Again, so we know where we're going and how we can get back there again. So first of all, I think we can just eliminate Catholic right off the bat. Honestly, there's no sense even really discussing it. These people that think somehow that we should be Catholic don't really respect our country, in my opinion, don't respect our founding. There's like 100 Catholic countries in the world. Go to one of those if you want a Catholic country. There's a lot of them. None of them are great, by the way. None of them are great. And they never were great. And they never will be great. America's unique in that. In the freedoms that we have here. And it came from a certain set of beliefs, a certain set of doctrines that has been instrumental in creating the greatest nation that's ever existed and the greatest nation that's done more to spread the gospel than every nation on earth put together throughout history. More people have been saved since America was created through the efforts of Americans than all the nations in history put together. It's just a fact. Okay, it's been a massive launch pad for the gospel throughout the world since its beginning. And now that's quickly dying, as it has in other places. People don't realize this, but like, for example, Pyongyang, North Korea, was once called the Jerusalem of the East because it had more Christians per capita than any place in the world. It was an incredible Christian place, and missionaries were being launched from there. This was just like 100 years ago, 120 years ago or something. And people don't even realize this history. And now it's the most oppressed place in the world, right? And that can happen here too, if we're not careful. And it seems like we're heading that direction pretty quickly. So, all right, let's start with a little bit of history. We're going to look back in the 1600s because that's really where the heart of America was created, not the 1700s. Everyone almost always focus on the founding fathers, right? The founding fathers were the 1600 real believers, real people with real ideas that founded this country, not the deists and the degenerates who get all the credit. Okay. All they did is take all the things, all the ideas, all the principles that were created by us through great Christian men and to secularize them, water them down to their own liking, to make them more politically correct or something, I guess you could say, and then publish it, which was the start of our downfall, honestly. So we're going to look back in the 1600s with a little bit of history, and then we'll get into some of the unique doctrines that we were established under. Everyone knows this story, basically. I think that, the Mayflower landed in Plymouth in 1620, right? Those were pilgrims that landed there. The difference between a pilgrim and a Puritan, by the way, pilgrims, they were both ex-members of the Church of England, and they wanted the Pilgrims wanted to separate completely, have nothing to do with the Church of England, and the Puritans wanted to separate from it and make it more pure. Okay, the Pilgrims were total 100% separatists. They created the town in Plymouth there, right? There was only like 100 people on the Mayflower. It wasn't like a huge endeavor. So everyone knows the story. They land in Plymouth. They befriend the Indians that were there. They're called, the tribe was Wampanoag Indians. The Wampanoags, just a little bit of, I don't want to go too far down this road. I could talk on the subject for literally hours, but the Wampanoag Indians were getting severely persecuted by a tribe south of them called the Narragansetts. And what had happened was there was a disease that came through and wiped out the Wampanoag Indians, right? And it had happened like a generation before that, further south to the Narragansetts, and their population had been decimated. But then, then the same thing happened to the Narragansetts. Their numbers got decimated. And so the Wampanoag were the Narragansetts were basically coming in there. And have you ever seen like an apocalypse movie where you have these different bands of people traveling around, and they like one will be stronger than another, or they'll come in and they're like take all their pretty girls and take all the crops that they want, and every year they'll come back and take half of all their crops. That's what was happening to the Wampanoags from the Narragansetts. And so when the Mayflower landed, the Wampanoags were like, "Oh, cool! Who are these tall white guys? With cool tech. Hey, you guys want to be friends? There's some bad guys down south of us. Maybe you could help us. You know, protect us from them." And so they said, "Sure," and they became friends. And so, yes, it was true that they did fight with some Indians, but they were fighting with other Indians to fight those Indians, right? So, anyway, that's a whole long story. It's a very interesting story, very important story for American history, and not being demoralized by the false tellings of our American history. But it's very interesting. So, anyhow, later on, they set up another colony, or another town, I guess you could say, it was set up, called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they were Puritans there. So they were the ones that wanted to purify the Church of England. They were very strict. All of them were. They were very, they escaped England to, escape persecution, religious persecution for their beliefs. And the first thing they did when they got here is they just started persecuting people who didn't agree with them, right? Kind of hypocritical. But that's what they did, sadly. These are all my ancestors, by the way. I got ancestors on all sides of this equation, so I'm not picking sides or anything. I had 25% of the Mayflowers, my ancestors, right? And a bunch of Puritans, a bunch of Baptists. So I'm not picking sides in this. I'm just telling the history as I've read it, as I know it. So the Puritans, I should say, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they set up a state church, right? So you have to pay taxes to the church. You have to go to their church. You can't teach doctrine like outside of their doctrine that they believe. And so what happened was, one of the famous ministers there, a guy named Roger Williams, started talking out about, first of all, their abuse of the Indians and stealing of their land. And the concept of soul liberty, meaning that the government shouldn't have influence over people's relationship with God and shouldn't try to dictate to them their relationship with God or what they should believe. And the last straw, obviously, was probably the baptism thing. Okay. So Roger Williams started believing that, the Church of England, just so you know, quick history here also, the Church of England, all these Protestant churches, all believed in what's called infant baptism, pedobaptism, right? And which means that you baptize babies, okay? Because they thought baptism was essential for salvation. They thought baptism was part of salvation. And so they would baptize a baby, baptize babies, and they thought that the baby was actually becoming saved at that point, right? Which is works, okay? It's works. And it's no more right when the Catholics do it than when these early when I'm talking about Protestants here, I'm talking about Protestants in the 1600s, not modern day people who call themselves Protestants, who aren't actually Protestants. Okay. But those folks in the 1600s would baptize babies. And when you get baptized as a baby, you not only got baptized into the church, but you get baptized into the state too, which is why they liked it so much, right? Because they're getting citizens. And so Roger Williams started teaching that you should only get baptized after you're born again. So it's called believer's baptism. Okay. And so you get baptized after you give your heart to Christ. Okay. And it's a big difference, because the second, believer's baptism is basically saying that, it's all by grace alone. Whereas the Protestants were teaching works, as the Catholics were. Protestants were basically just Catholic light. And by the way, Baptist existed long before Luther. They existed all the way back, okay, to the New Testament church. There's lots of examples of Catholics, like in AD 1000, of hating Baptists and condemning Baptists. Luther instantly started murdering Baptists, called for their death. Protestants were drowning, like Zwingli and Calvin were killing Baptists. So where do these Baptists come from? They didn't happen at the same time. They already existed. So they went by different names, like, you know, I won't get into all the names, but they went by different names, which had distinctions in their doctrine. But the core element that bound them all together was they all believed in believers' baptism. That's where the term Baptist comes from, right? It actually came from a term Anabaptist. Ana means re. So they were basically calling them rebaptizers, which doesn't make any sense because infant baptism doesn't really count as a baptism anyway. So, but that's what they were called. They were called Anabaptists originally, and then it got shortened to just be Baptist. And so Roger Williams became a Baptist, and so the Church of the Massachusetts Bay Colony rather started persecuting him, threatening him, things like that, and under a law there called Teaching New and Dangerous Opinions, which is the name of this channel, New and Dangerous Opinions, which is what it's named after. So they persecute him with this law, New and Dangerous Opinions, and they were going to banish him, but or worse, and send him back to England or kill him. And so he ran into the wilderness in, I think it was 1635, October 1635. He was sick at the time, actually, and if you've ever been to Rhode Island in the wintertime, this was a particularly bad winter, and so he was pretty close to dying. The Wampanoags took him in. Again, he'd become really, really friendly with not only the Wampanoag tribe, but with the Narragansetts also. He actually translated from the Algonquin languages he translated the Bible into the Algonquin languages, and actually wrote an entire dictionary, giving them a written text, which is now being used, by the way, to restore the Wampanoag language. Interesting. He's a fascinating guy. He spoke like a dozen languages. Very, very smart man, and very fair man. He really was good friends with these Indian tribes, and especially they really respected him also a lot. I won't get into the whole story there, but there's a whole story after this story that happens years later, where there's what's called King Philip's War, and they come in and take him out because they respected him so much before they start fighting. It's fascinating history. But anyway, so he gets banished. He runs into the wilderness all by himself, right? Wife and kids still at the house. The Wampanoag take him in, and they gave him some land, but the Massachusetts Bay Colony claimed ownership of that land. So then they took him further south, and Narragansetts ended up giving him a bunch of land, which he named Providence, Rhode Island. And so then they established this new colony there called Providence. The proper name for Rhode Island, by the way, was Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. That's its actual legal name. Up until like 10 years ago, they changed it, I guess, because they didn't like the word plantations being in their name because it reminded them of slavery, I guess, or something. But that was the actual legal name, was Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. And so he forms Providence. The first thing they do basically is pass laws there, declaring soul liberty is the number one law. And then the second law was no slavery. So, which was, a big deal back then. Later, they went and about, I guess it was in 1660, I think it was, or 16, something like that. They actually went to England and got a charter granting them to become an independent nation, total sovereign nation, independent, sovereign, standalone nation. Okay. It passed their own laws, didn't have to do anything, weren't accountable to anybody. Even when the Revolutionary War started, they weren't even really a part of it because they had already gotten their freedom. And so this was really the first Baptist. It was a Baptist colony. It was created by Baptists. And the two ways you can tell that is, number one, that they believed in these. Let me just go through some of these distinctives that separate Baptists from Protestants. So I'm not going to go into all of them, obviously, but just a couple of them to highlight. And then we can look at how that obviously has been applied into our current future government, or at least our past government, not so much now. But anyway, there's like 8 of them. Biblical authority, autonomy of the local church, priesthood of believers, 2 ordinances, individual soul liberty, which is what we're talking about there. Um, Save baptized church membership, meaning only saved people get baptized, 2 offices, and separation of church and state. So those are the kind of the Baptist distinctives that make Baptists different than Protestants. As I said, the Protestants were persecuting people for their own beliefs, for what they believe, right? You didn't have freedom of religion. You didn't have free speech there at all. Okay. Um, so then this Baptist colony was established. That concept there, the Baptist concept of soul liberty, is really where we get our First Amendment from, which is a very important concept to remember in our history. Um, Let me read this really quick about Roger Williams. I mean, it's not all complete, it's just Wikipedia, but it's a pretty good little outline here. So, Roger Williams was an English born New England minister, theologian, author, and founder of Providence Plantations, which became the colony of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, and later the state of Rhode Island. He was a staunch advocate for religious liberty, separation of church and state, fair dealings with the Native Americans. Initially a Puritan minister, his beliefs evolved, and he questioned the authority of the Puritan church in enforcing religious conformity. He was expelled by the Puritan leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he established Providence Plantations in 1636 as a refuge offering what he termed liberty of conscience, making Rhode Island the first government in the Western world to guarantee religious freedom in its founding charter. His ideas on religious tolerance and civil government directly influenced the principles later established in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. He briefly became a Baptist in 1638. He founded the First Baptist Church in America, Providence. Then he moved beyond organized religion, becoming a seeker who did not identify with any specific church. Williams studied the language of New England Native Americans and published the first book length study on it in English. Today, Williams' legacy continues to shape debates on religious liberty and the role of government in matters of conscience, with his writings cited in legal arguments and Supreme Court decisions on the separation of church and state. You know, his writings, by the way, really were basically, as I said earlier, just totally plagiarized by people like Paine and Jefferson. And Jefferson double plagiarized, right? Paine plagiarized, and then Jefferson would just take Paine. But it would all came from these Baptist guys' writings, basically, right? All these concepts of soul liberty and separation of church and state all came from these Baptists in Providence and Rhode Island. And they just watered it down. They watered it down, took the heart out of it. And that's why we really don't have, that's kind of what led to our falling away, in my opinion. So anyway, the way you can tell that America really was, you can't say the first Baptist country because Providence was the first, Rhode Island was the first Baptist country because it was an independent country, right? The way you can tell America is the first Baptist country, not Protestant country, certainly not Catholic country. By the way, all these people, the Puritans, the Pilgrims, the Baptists, all believed the Catholic Church was the whore of Babylon and some future pope would be the Antichrist. They all despised the Catholic Church. There was one colony called Maryland, obviously, that was founded by Catholics, quickly overrun by Protestants. They did everything they could to try to, they persecuted Protestants straight away, again, of course, and anyone else. And then when they realized their numbers were getting overwhelmed, they basically just created this law for religious tolerance, basically to cover their own butts when they lost control, which they did shortly thereafter, and they were kicked out anyway, or at least banished from holding any public offices. So even in Maryland, Catholics weren't allowed to hold public office. Okay, so anyhow, like I said, we can just eliminate Catholic stuff from the equation entirely. It's a silly argument that these people make. If you've ever read the writings of some of these guys in the 1700s, they weren't fans of the Catholic Church. Anyhow, so the way you can tell that America really is a Baptist nation, not a Protestant nation, as people always say, is by the simple fact that we have what's called soul liberty, because no one ever had that before, right? That's an exclusively Baptist thing, okay? Everywhere else, you were part of the church and part of the state. They were one and the same. There was no difference between the two, basically, okay? Baptists don't think like that. right? They think your relationship with God and your relationship with the government are two totally separate things, which they are, of course, right? We're all given three authority structures by God to protect us in this world: family, government, church. Those things are created for us, not us for them, not us to serve them. Those things are created for us to help us in this world, to protect us from the danger of this world. Okay. When they don't, when they're not in your best interest for your own protection and your own service to God, then you should have nothing to do with them. It's that simple. That's the concept of soul liberty. Um, so, anyhow, the way you can tell is number one, obviously, this concept of soul liberty, which created our First Amendment. It's unique. Our First Amendment is unique in all the world, in any other country, because it's a decentralized form of free speech. These other countries, it's basically just top down. The government says what's allowed speech and what's not allowed speech, and everyone has to obey. The way it's supposed to work in America, that they're constantly trying to subvert and turn us into these other terrible places, is they want to say, well, what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to say, okay, can't slander somebody, okay? Can't yell fire in a movie theater, okay? And can't incite violence against somebody or something like that. Those are just like baselines. Direct violence against somebody immediately, right? Those are just baselines for free speech. But after that, the government should have nothing to do with anything to do with anyone's opinions about anything, okay? That's a decentralized form of free speech. That's the concept where we get this concept of soul liberty from. That's what our First Amendment was originally built on. Okay. Now they're trying to take control of it from the government and then institute that downward, just like every other place in the world has always done. Okay. It's nothing unique, and it's disgraceful, because that's the one main thing that makes us unique in all the world, is that one concept. And they're doing it with everything. They always make it out like, oh, it's for the kids. So we got to protect the Jews. So you can't be anti-Semitic, or you can't make fun of LGBT or whatever, right? And they pass these hate speech laws and things like that. Those are all direct attacks on the First Amendment. They should never be tolerated by anybody. I don't care what your political opinion is or anything else. They just shouldn't be tolerated. It should get worked out on its own, one way or another. You don't take away the First Amendment ever for whatever excuse. Right? And all these guys don't care about anybody. They're just doing it because they're being paid. Let's be real. So, and the second way you can tell that America is actually a Baptist country and not a Protestant country is the fact that all these people nowadays that call themselves Protestants are actually Baptists. Because almost you won't meet a Protestant hardly at all that thinks you have to baptize a baby or else it's going to go to hell. Okay? No Protestants believe that. They believe in believers' baptism, which makes them a rebaptizer, an Anabaptist, a Baptist. So it's really silly. I mean, the whole thing that, these are Protestants. You're not a Protestant. In the 1600s, if you believed in believers' baptism, as all Protestants pretty much do nowadays, you would have been called a Baptist and thrown out of Massachusetts Bay Colony and everywhere else, right? So it's Baptist. They're Baptist. Okay. Those are the two of the main distinctives. Obviously, baptism, hence the name Baptist, right? Those are the two main distinctives. And then from that cleaning of the gospel that we did here through the founding of Providence and Rhode Island plantations, went out the largest gospel evangelism campaign in the last 400 years that's ever existed on planet Earth. Okay. Like I said, more souls have been saved since then in the cleaning up of the gospel and all these missionary efforts that were sent out and launched out all over the world. More people have been saved in this time period than all of history. Okay. It's an amazing thing, and it's sad that it's falling, and it's sad to watch it fall, but I don't think it's too late. I think we just need to keep speaking the truth, keep preaching the gospel, and let people decide for themselves. And if they don't, separate. That's what Providence did. So anyhow, thank you for listening. Again, I'm Derek Peterson from Providence Post. Have a good day. Thanks.